This conversation is part of our Social Innovators series, where we invite people in who are doing the work of social innovation, trying to address some of the complex problems that we have with new approaches. If you are not yet familiar with the center, I invite you to go to our website, and so when we use the word social innovation or social innovation approaches, they're defined there. And you'll see that we focus on some of the complex problems that we face here in society, and we do it by applying processes that are kind of innovative, which means that they're inclusive and iterative. Today we have two really exciting innovators who are working at an organization called Opportunities at Work. They both have really interesting backgrounds. I don't want to spend a ton of time on them. I would invite them to share what you think is the most interesting part of your background. For me, for Papia, it's certainly your work in the Obama administration, but there's so many other things there. Our two speakers today are Papia Debroy and Kate Naranjo. And what we're going to do in the conversation, this is an open meeting, meaning that you will have the opportunity to engage with us directly in the chat. While they're doing their initial presentation, if you have a clarifying question, when you put it in the chat, put the words clarifying in some sort of parenthesis so that I, in managing the chat, will be able to uplift it to them. After about 20 to 30 minutes, we will have an opportunity to have very open-ended dialogue about the work that they're doing and questions that you might have for them. So with that, let me turn it over to Papia and Kate to tell us about their work at Opportunity at Work.
Thank you so much, Gary. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's so nice to see all your faces on the screen today. Thanks for joining us. As Gary mentions, my name is Papia Debroy, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kate Naranjo, today. I'll let her introduce herself in just a moment, but we work for an organization called Opportunity at Work. We're a nonprofit. We're based out of Washington, D.C., and our primary objective is to actually support workers in the U.S. labor market who don't have four-year college degrees. Our goal is to try and improve opportunities for them so that they experience more economic mobility in their local regions. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about work and workers and where there are opportunities for us to actually shift trajectories of a lot of families in the United States. So before I dive in, Kate, do you want to do a quick intro for the group? And then I'll share a little bit of background about myself too, and we'll dive in.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Naranjo. I'm the director of the STARS policy project here at Opportunity at Work. As you'll see from our presentation in just a few minutes, policy is an incredibly important lever, an incredibly important tool of change as we think about improving STARS opportunity to mobility. So I'm excited and honored to be starting to lead the work around what it really looks like to create economic mobility for workers in the United States today. I come to this work from an economic mobility background, and most recently I was at the University of Michigan's Poverty Solutions, working under Luke Shaefer. So thinking about what a university's responsibility is in the economic mobility ecosystem. Papia, I'll pass it back to you to introduce yourself and get us started.
Great, thanks, Kate. So I lead the research work here at Opportunity at Work, and my training is as a political scientist. I did my doctorate in political science at the University of Michigan as well, actually, coincidentally. And my work for the last 10 years, though, has been in working with large corporate employers, right? And actually helping them think about their workforces and how they approach their own work in hiring, retaining, and helping workers move on from their jobs. And I come to this work here at Opportunity at Work with the angle of how do we think about workforces, not just as employees at companies, but as a supply of people who can support business objectives, right, for our local labor market. So with that, I'm gonna ask everyone to share in the chat what their first job was. Well, I want you all to be keeping this job in mind as we share with you some of the insights we want to share about this population. For me, my first job was as a babysitter, and it was a really hard job. It's really hard to work with little kids and to have patience, and there's a lot that I learned on that job. What I want to share is that there are actually maybe I'll situate this in the context of the US population. What you see on the black bar here is how many of us there are in the United States. There's a little less than 350 million of us. About half of our population is not active in our labor force, right? These are folks who are retired or children. On the right-hand side of the page, what you see is our active population. These are the folks who are showing up to work most days. And of them, you'll find that a little more than 60 million have a college degree or a higher level of educational attainment. What you see on the purple all the way on the right-hand side of the page is that there are more than 70 million workers in the United States labor market who have a high school diploma, but don't have a four-year college degree. And what's really interesting about them, well, there's so many interesting things about them, but they come from pretty much all groups you could possibly imagine today, right? So they're geographically distributed across the entire country. We do see an overrepresentation of Black workers and Hispanic workers in this group. So 62% of Black workers in the United States are stars, 55% of Hispanic workers are stars. We see that they come from a lot of groups that employers are specifically focused on recruiting, right? So a disproportionate volume of veterans are stars, returning citizens are stars, returning caregivers are stars. And we do see a kind of equal distribution of both men and women in this group. But that's really relevant and important because as we think about just how many people there are to need this kind of support, they actually do see a lot, we see a lot of diversity within this pool as well. What is less well known when we share more information about this population is how they're faring today in our US labor force. So traditionally in the United States, when you earn a four-year college degree, you enter the workforce earning more than the star, right? The worker who is skilled through alternative routes and doesn't have the four-year college degree. That has historically been the case in the United States. What's interesting about this generation is that whereas they're earning less when they enter the labor force at the age of 25, what we see is that that trajectory doesn't shift very much. And in fact, 30 years into their career, the star is still not earning what the bachelor's degree worker was earning at the age of 25. That shift, right, in inequality that workers are experiencing as a function of their educational attainment, that's relatively new to this generation. And that's a stunning inequality, right? Because this is not just the 70 million workers we're talking about the 70 million workers and their families, right? So this is having a tremendous impact on inequality in our society today. I want to go back to the earlier question because I want to think a little bit about how we start to understand this population from the perspective of what positive attributes they're bringing into the labor market. So with that, what I'd love for you to do next is think about that job that you had and tell me about a skill that you learned in that job that's still important to you today. A lot of you are mentioning communication, customer service, time management is a big one. The insight that has anchored a lot of our research is that we actually gain a lot of skills by showing up to a job and having to learn a skill and practice that skill every day. And a lot of our work is anchored in that fundamental concept. How do we start to give people credit for the fact that we learn skills in all kinds of ways? And what we've been trying to do is actually operationalize and measure that concept that when you show up and you get work experience, you're actually building skills, and those skills should have some currency for all of us, right, as we navigate our careers. And so I'm going to introduce you to a concept and I'm going to geek out with you guys for just a minute. But one of the ways we have been really trying to push the field in our thinking is that a lot of us tend to study workers by their level of educational attainment. So we treat workers with the bachelor's degree as skilled. We treat the workers without bachelor's degrees as unskilled or sub-baccalaureate. We assign a lot of terminology to this group that actually doesn't give them credit for exactly the skills that many of you have put in the chat. So what we wanted to try and do is first change that, right? What would it look like for us with our research to actually better understand the skills of this part of the workforce? So what we've done is we've made a couple of assumptions here. Let's say you're a retail worker. You're required to bring persuasion, active listening, speaking skills to your job every day. In fact, there's about 35 skills in this vector that the Bureau of Labor Statistics says you need to be able to show up to work every day as a retail worker. What we find is that there's actually several other jobs in the labor market that require very similar skills, but that pay more than a retail worker. And you see an example of this on the page here. A retail worker is required to bring similar skills to their job as a customer service rep. So theoretically, someone should be able to make a transition from a retail worker to a customer service rep. And so this was kind of a hypothesis we started a lot of our work with in early 2020. In fact, we published some work relating to this concept in early 2020, March of 2020, in fact. Why we thought this was important was because these skills should be able to predict where someone might be able to go in the labor market. And specifically, what we found was that if you study the skills of an entire workforce this way, and we're focused specifically on the 70 million workers we call stars, there's actually quite a few people who could be able to make transitions. And let me talk you through that. We find that there's more than 5 million workers today who are almost proof points for us. We call them shining stars. These are workers who, with the skills they've gained on the job, have made transitions into high wage occupations in their local labor market. On the far right-hand side of the page, we find that there are more than 35 million forming stars. These are workers who, based on the skills they have today, could maybe make some minor transitions in the US labor market, but they're not going to lead to significant mobility for them. But what's interesting to us is what you see in the middle of the page, the rising stars. These are folks who do have the skills to make transitions to significantly higher wage work if they were given the opportunity to do so. Right? So part of our hypothesis coming in at Opportunity at Work was, what would it look like for us to activate the skills of these 30 million individuals to truly realize their potential in the US labor market? That's what we wanted to hypothesize. What we've done since then is try and understand, well, are these workers moving into occupations? Do we see the retail worker become the customer service rep? And if so, when is that happening? So this is work that we published in a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper this summer. We did it jointly with Peter Blair, who's a professor in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And we studied all 130 million transitions that workers have made in the last 10 years. What we find is that that transition that I displayed earlier, that's actually exactly how all of us move through the labor market. That's what you see on the left-hand side of the page. We move to jobs that look very similar from our previous jobs. What's interesting is that bachelor's degree workers actually get access to much bigger jumps in the US labor market. They get access to a bunch of jobs that don't actually map to their previous jobs. Well, that's not exactly what we were, that's not exactly the guidance that we were hoping we would land on through this analysis. Where it was interesting to us, though, to start to better understand some of this data is that while stars frequently are being forced to make transitions to jobs that pay less and are very similar in skills to their own, there are 40% of the time when stars are experiencing upward mobility with their skills. And to us, this provides some clues on what it might look like to actually start to see a larger population of workers experience mobility over time. Specifically, what we find is that workers are moving through what we call pathways, right? Job 1 to job 2, job 2 to job 3. And when they achieve mobility in their stars, they're frequently moving from an origin job to one of 50 occupations that we call a gateway job in the US labor market. And these are jobs that provide the ability to move to from a skills-based transition. But even more interestingly, they lead to further mobility, right? So they allow for the worker to continue to build on their career over time and increase their wages as well. Now, this is significant, right? Because we're starting to better understand how workers actually increase their wages over time when they don't have the four-year college degree. What we're working on right now is a study that will this is coming out a little bit later this year, but what we're finding is that the proportion of stars who are getting access to the gateway job has fallen drastically. In fact, where stars used to make up 57% of workers in gateway and destination jobs in the year 2000, they make up 44% of those workers today. That's a 13% drop in access to middle and high wage jobs in just the past 20 years. What that means is that there are 12 million stars who today would have been in middle and high wage jobs had they just maintained their share from the year 2000. That's pretty stunning, right? And that's the problem that we're trying to work on, is how do we help employers see that workers are gaining skills that are valuable on the job? Those skills are being rewarded. People are being given access to transitions. Stars aren't being given access to transitions the same way that other workers are. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to share a little bit more about how we're thinking about what to do about this problem.
Yeah, so as Papia mentioned, next slide, the problem is relatively new, right? We're talking about since the Great Recession, 26% of jobs were created in occupations where employers typically do not require a four-year college degree, and 60% of the adult workforce is stars. So, the math just doesn't work out there. And we know that these are choices that employers are making every day as to what jobs they're putting on as requiring a bachelor's degree and what jobs they're not. And this problem exacerbates racial and ethnic inequality. If you want to go to the next slide, Papia, we know that women and people of color are disproportionately in these low and middle wage occupations, and they're not making the same kinds of upwardly mobile transitions that we see white star counterparts making. For comparison points, in the labor market as a whole, 31% of workers are in low wage occupations, 56% of workers are in middle wage occupations, and 13% of workers are in high wage occupations. So it's a massive differential between who gets access to those high wage occupations and who doesn't. And I just want to share the next slide as an opportunity for us to reflect on the real life impact that this has on stars and their families every day. So I'll give you a moment to read the quote. And as we're thinking about moving forward from, all of the disruption that's happened in our labor market since the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, since the pandemic caused a massive uproar in the labor market and the labor shortages that we're seeing today, I really do believe, and I think at Opportunity at Work, we believe this is a moment to do things differently and to make different choices so that in 20 years, we aren't looking back at those numbers and saying, wow, what a math mismatch, what a discrepancy between workers who have access to these jobs and workers who don't. And so we think a lot about where on the STARS learning to earning journey, as we call it, the process breaks down, what labor market practices are preventing stars from achieving higher wages. There's probably another 25 to 100 factors that could be included, but the primary point I'd like to raise is that stars are impacted by both employer policies, choices that employers are making every day, and government policies, choices that the government makes in terms of where they invest and where they don't, what they enforce and what they don't. And we think that this is an opportunity to really start to change the way that these labor market practices work so that stars are able to access the gateway jobs that Papia is talking about before. And I'll pass it back to her to share a little bit more about what a more equitable future might look like.
I think there's a lot of ways for us to think about imagining the future, right? Pretty much anyone's imagination can come up with what that future looks like. For us, it means that we're starting to think a little bit differently about a subset of jobs in the US labor market, right? There are a number of occupations where we see just fundamental shifts in who's getting access. And I think for us, one of the first steps on the company side is helping them recognize what that barrier is doing to a local labor market, right? And so we have a number of jobs that we are saying, let's look at these together, right? And let's make determinations about where there are opportunities for us to improve mobility by giving access to stars to these jobs. But I think beyond that, there's a lot of other levers for us to be thinking about beyond just company behavior, right? And I think that's where Kate would love to pull you in from the policy perspective as well.
Yeah, and just to contextualize a set of these questions that we're starting to think about, it's often the case in the workforce development field that we start with the worker. We start with what do we need to do as a policy community, as a workforce development community to fix that worker so that they have the right skills for the next job. And I'd like for us to think a little bit differently about not fixing the worker, but fixing the system. In particular, because we know that workers already have an enormous number of skills that are not being leveraged in today's labor market. And how do we make it possible for them to use those skills, particularly to make higher wage transitions? So just a few I'd like to call out here, though there are many more. Today, the bachelor's degree, as Papia mentioned, is baked into skilled versus unskilled work definitions in our labor market statistics. And we could measure that differently. We could make different choices about how we choose to decide what occupations are skilled and who has skills, in particular around, not using a bachelor's degree as a proxy for any skills in particular. The second is around using better labor market data to shift the risk of training from stars. And what do I mean by that? If I'm a star in a local labor market who's looking to get a better wage job and I'm trying to do it through a training program, it's all on me to find where the right training program is that matches up with a set of jobs that might be in demand in my local labor market. And then I often have to pay for it out of my own pocket. And all of those things make it incredibly risky for a star to invest in training. So I'd like to think about how could we use government policy to shift that risk from stars onto employers and onto government actors. There's also a question of thinking about how our safety net is built or not built here in America right now. Right now, we are lucky if the safety net catches people from falling into extreme poverty. But what I'd like us to imagine is what a trampoline might look like, what it might look like for when that moment a star loses their job, instead of just being able to access unemployment. What would it look like if they were to access wraparound services, were able to access the right set of training to help them get another job based on their previous job, rather than falling through the cracks? And the last piece is, I'm very curious and interested in how the labor shortage is going to affect worker power as it shows up in the market. I'm hopeful that it will drive wages up, and I'm hopeful that that will increase the value of stars' skills. But I think this misperception of a labor shortage is really helping everyone think differently about the skills that exist in our labor market and the value of those skills. So I remain an optimist. I remain hopeful that we could imagine a different future for stars. And I'll leave it there and pass it back to Gary.
Thank you both. I appreciate that you didn't leave us with a dystopian vision of our future, even though this is, Halloween is right around the corner. So some of us may have wanted to wrestle with that. There's a couple of things that come to mind for me, and then I'm going to invite the audience again to get ready your questions. And when you do have a question, please just use the raise hand feature in the reaction, and then we'll be able to have you just share that question to everyone. You can also put it in the chat and I can go through it that way if you'd prefer that, or you're in a spot where you're not able to ask the question yourself. So one thing that comes to mind is it sounds like you're wrestling with, I think the field is wrestling with, what kinds of shifts have caused the labor market to be disproportionately disadvantaging this group of workers. And I don't know if this research that you've done, or maybe in some of the interventions or programs or practices that you may be studying or even helping to facilitate, if you've noticed if there are new specific barriers, or if, what are barriers in the labor market for some people. For instance, if you have arrest in your record, or a conviction in your record or something like that, we know that can be used, despite policies around ban the box, can still be used in a hiring process to potentially disadvantage workers that have, as you were noting, I think you did an amazing job of noting what kinds of skills are based there. And then that can sometimes reinforce inequality because we know of disproportionate policing practices that exist in the United States. So that was one question. And then if you don't mind, after answering that, I have one other follow-up, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Sure, I can jump in there first. I think our reflections are, there are actually a lot of variables that have shifted in the last 30 years that have led to this outcome for STARS. I'll name a couple that we've been learning more about on our end, but certainly don't have answers to right now. Certainly the shareholder driver on the employer side has really shifted fundamentally the time horizon on which companies are expected to be producing specific results, right? And that's actually a really big driver of how we've seen incentives shift within company structures and why we see specific policies towards workers look the way that they look. It really, there is a cascade effect there. I think alongside that, we don't have longitudinal data on attitudes and beliefs towards this population over time, but some of the most recent survey data work that we've done this year suggests that managers tend to believe that the majority of the workforce does have a four-year college degree, and therefore they almost believe that it's a requirement for a good job. And what you see on the converse side is that STARS experience that in the workplace, right? They are frequently perceiving that they're not as valued as their bachelor's degree counterparts. That is a shift, right, in the past generation. I do think that, these shifts have also happened as the internet has taken off, right? And when you talk to an employer, they'll frequently say, I would evaluate 15, 20 resumes in the year 2000 for some of these jobs, and I'm now evaluating 2000, right? I've had to deploy a set of systems and filters to actually evaluate the volume of candidates who are applying to jobs today. And the easiest filter to put on a job to screen one group in and screen another group out is the bachelor's degree, right? And so in many respects, many of them will share with us, we have STARS in these jobs. We know we have STARS in these jobs. We don't know where to find the next star, right? It's really hard to go through 2000 applications to genuinely bring in the right worker. And those are, I have a lot of empathy for that, right? Those are hard things to figure out. It's our job, right, as we build back better to figure some of those things out. So I think that's what I would start with, Gary, but there's a lot more there. Kate, is there anything you would add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, there's been a sort of shift in the K-12 space to move more people to college, right? That's the outcome of a successful K-12 experience. And as such, I think we're seeing employers use the bachelor's degree as a proxy for all kinds of things, right? The grit, the ability to stick with it, the ability to make it, and, a whole set of sort of cultural fit things about you'll fit in it at my firm. And I think because we're using that proxy, it highly disadvantages STARS, right? I would argue that STARS have the same amount of grit, and we know who is able to make it through college and who is not. And we know, the data tells us that so much of that is determined by your family income. And so for me, it's become, not that I am anti-college, I am very pro, people going to college, furthering their education, but who has access and who's able to persist in a college environment is radically segregated, and I think is sort of retrenching some of the challenges that Papia raised in her answer.
Yeah, and one thing I heard in your answer as well, which ties to my other question, is some sort of perception of risk that employers may be facing, and therefore they're maybe approaching it with a low risk strategy. If I know someone's, and I think your point, Kate, was right on this. If I know someone has a college degree, then that might tell me something about like how quickly they can learn in these shifts and transitions. Do they have grit? All these kinds of things, and it's just a simpler way to screen people. It sounds to me that part of the work that you're interested in doing, and this certainly is, part of where the field of social innovation does operate, is in kind of narrative and cultural change, so that people who have a set of beliefs in culture may actually need to somehow unlearn them and, in fact, kind of experience what they should be learning in one way or another. And of course, there's different kinds of social innovation approaches that you also may be interested in. Like I could imagine you working with a group of employers or working with partners that are working with employers to kind of try new ways to engage in new practices around hiring and skills assessment and all those kinds of things. And so I was curious, as it relates to social innovation, if you'd say a little bit more about your interest and or practice and work around kind of this narrative shift piece. And then if you could also talk about what you may have done at all in working with partners that are looking at kind of a reassessment of skills and how they're implementing that and what barriers they're finding in doing so, if you've done that work yet. I know you're a new organization, so you can only do so many things at once.
We're trying to do a lot of things. So I'll maybe break it down into layman's terms. And we have kind of an air game approach and a ground game approach. And our air game approach is really trying to address the narrative and the culture challenges that we see that are driving this inequality for this population. And what I mean by that is that from our perspective, any shift in how a population is viewed is a function of good research and insight about what is happening to that population, what it looks like for those outcomes to actually shift, and for the narrative to follow, right? And so we have a team a team at our own organization that's focused on that. But a lot of this we believe will be done through partners, right? Through other organizations who are on the ground working with STARS and helping them actually recognize and bring language to a group of workers who have largely been left behind and outside of our discourse, right, daily. And that's certainly a really critical part of what we're trying to do. And the research side is trying to equip people who are really good at narratives with the insight they need to actually change those hearts and minds, right? And we have a number of work streams kind of focused on that.
Papia, can I add one thing on the STARS narrative before you move on to the ground game? One thing we've seen is that employers will often have a set of initiatives around opportunity youth or veterans or returning citizens or mothers returning to the workforce. And they think about it as sort of a one-off program. And I think part of what's been so powerful about Papia's work on insights and our sort of air game approach is it brings all these groups together with one umbrella term, that we think is an empowering term. So rather than it being, I should have a strategy on, 12 small subcategories, it's really about how do we think about these workers as a whole. Sorry to interrupt you, Papia. Go back.
No, I think that's such a critical part of how we think that there will ultimately be change at scale, right? So that this is no longer a program where, success is 15 workers gained access to the job, but we want companies to be thinking in the hundreds and thousands, right? As they're thinking about changes. And there's no way to do that without creating that umbrella opportunity. I think on the ground game, we're experimenting. I would say we're in the early stages of this, but we've launched a beta technology platform. We have an entire technology and product team at the organization, and they are trying to build the thing that no for-profit entity can do, right? Which is actually build a market for STARS. And we're doing that by actually, it's using the best of technology today to actually match us, right? If Netflix can suggest what I should watch tonight, ideally we should be able to suggest to an employer, this is another worker in your region who has the skills, they've gained them through alternative routes, and you should consider them for your job. And so we're actually bringing employers onto the platform. These are employers who have said we're willing to consider STARS for these middle and high wage occupations. We're bringing STARS onto the platform through non-traditional training providers in community colleges and local regions. And we're actually matching people. And it's actually been a phenomenal experience to observe, one, the STAR experience, right? Many of them have the experience of, I think one of the first STARS I talked to who had gotten placed said that she had applied to something like 350 jobs last year and never heard back from any of them. Right. And she's like, I have no idea if it was because I just got screened out, if I didn't have the skills. And you just think like, that's so much time. That's so much time that this person spent and didn't get any response from anyone about why it was they weren't getting access to the job. And so, there's such an information failure for workers. On the employer side, there's actually a group of employers right now, I think of them as champions for STARS, who have recognized this pool of talent and are working through the challenge of, I'm having to work with 50 providers in my region, training providers or educators who focus on one small subset of stars. And that's a lot of work for us. It's a lot of relationships to manage in a local ecosystem. Instead of all of that could be aggregated in one place, I could find all of the training providers in one place and then source that way. That would make it a lot easier for us. And so we're actually working with Workday, which is the largest applicant tracking system and HR information provider. And we've built this platform now, and it's in the market in San Francisco and DC, and we are learning a ton. Mostly, I've been finding the stories very, very inspiring. So those are the two quick answers, Gary, to what we're trying to do.
That's very exciting. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate and Papia. Professor Pam McKeon is going to lead us off with audience questions. Thank you, Pam.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. Hi, Papia. Hi, Kate. It's really good to see you both again. I have a question. So, Kate, you had mentioned at the beginning of your part of the presentation how policy is this important lever that we need to sort of take into account. And I think it was in one of the later slides, then there was this really cool graphic showing how employer-based policies and government-based policies have an important impact on stars and workers in general. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you see that moving forward? Because you've talked about education policy, K through 12 policy, higher ed policy, childcare policy, industrial regulations, workforce policy, safety net issues, unemployment policies. There's just like so many different ways I could see this moving forward. So what are your thoughts on where you want to go policy wise?
Yeah, so my biggest thought, Pam, and my biggest reflection over the past 10 months as we've started to build the STARS policy project is that I think of our organization as the leading expert on stars because of the work that Papia has done. We have really great insight into where these workers are, the skills they have, the things they could bring to the labor market if they were able to. And our partner organizations have information on the rest, right? So how do we marry the STARS narrative and help our policy friends, move their narrative along concurrently to the employer narrative moving along? I think that's equally as important, right? So, the policy space has a set of hypotheses about who is talented and who is not in this country and sort of the way we leverage those talents. And I'd like to move some of their change as well. As for what we think of as policy priorities for us, what we're working on, there's a few sort of preliminary ideas. And again, we're a 5-year-old organization who are rapidly testing and learning and growing every day. But one of them, and the one that stands out most for me these days, is just the power that the federal government has to sort of block STARS hiring is how I'll put the umbrella term. So one important thing is, 10% of STARS are employed by the federal, state, and local governments. What might it look like for them to start to open up their pathways? And I've been having some exciting conversations with a group out of Houston, thinking about how do we help STARS be integrated into their city's talent planning operations. They're an employer just like everybody else. We know that I think it's 1.5 million STARS are home health aides. They're predominantly STARS, they're predominantly women of color. And what does it look like for us to value their labor? And their wages are typically set by the federal government, right? So there's a set of demand side policies that I'm really interested in as the starting point, though I think there's also a question of how we move the whole field forward to think about STARS more generally in all of these things, because STARS they're just people, right? And so they're touched by every aspect of this policy environment.
Great, thank you. David has a question in the chat. David, I don't know if you can ask it. If not, I'll ask it for you. So he's asking who you see as some of the other leaders in the field who are trying to work through either collective impact approaches or other approaches to really connect policymakers, STARS, and for-profit employers together so that we can actually see demonstrated progress here.
I love this question. Just to give you a little bit of a little bit of insight on how workers are distributed across firms. If you look at data from 30 years ago, stars were, the majority of them were employed by large enterprise companies, right? So companies that employed tens of thousands of workers. What we see today is that almost 60% of stars are employed by small and medium-sized businesses, employers that have fewer than 1,000 workers. And so a lot of the champions that we have met are in organizations like that. Frequently, you'll find that a person in a leadership position at those organizations is a star themselves, and they have latched on to the work and they're really excited about the positive terminology and the asset-based language that we're using to actually drive this work forward. That being said, we primarily work with large enterprise organizations. And if I think about what championship looks like in that space, it actually looks like a lot of different things, right? On one end of the spectrum, you have Walmart. Walmart employs the highest volume of one of the jobs that we see a really high volume of, workers in an origin job, right? As cashiers and retail salespeople. And that part of their employee value proposition now is, what does it look like for you to experience mobility out of this occupation? And that's a really important part of our move forward, right? Is the recognition that workers are not staying at an employer for their entire careers, that they are moving across jobs. And part of our civic responsibility, right, as employers, is to ensure that workers get access to that next job and that hopefully it's a better job, right? And so I think some of the work that they're doing to actually be really deliberate about that in the context of their own employer planning cycle is really inspiring. On the other end of the spectrum, we've been working with Google for some time now. Google is an organization that, if you think of the type of impact they can have within their own four walls, that's certainly tremendous. But think about the impact they can have through their products and services. One of the things that we have been thinking a lot about is, what would it look like for stars to learn what middle and high wage jobs they have access to in their local labor market without having to continue to apply and not hear back, right? Google did that this year. They deployed a service that actually allows you to search for a job without a four-year college degree. And that's a huge step forward for stars, right? Like, let's actually give them the information they need to drive efficiency. And so I think there's a lot of ways it's manifesting, especially in this environment. I will say, there's never been a moment like this, right? I think there's genuine interest and desire in shifting behavior. And so we're just, I can't say enough about how exciting it's been to see how much progress some companies are making internally.
Yeah, I think the two other things I'd add to that, Papia, is, or maybe one overarching and two examples is the sort of public commitment that's being made to stars is not something that we have seen before. So 110 is probably the most prominent example of this. It's a group of companies that's agreed to hire 1 million Black workers in 10 years into family sustaining jobs, is what they call it. And those workers that they're talking about are Black stars. And so that's really exciting to see the public commitment be to this particular group of workers who are so at risk of being left behind as we think about rebuilding our economy. And then the second thing is, and this is not something you would have caught if you were not looking for it, but President Biden has mentioned in several speeches that it's important to him that 90% of the jobs created by the bills he's talking about are open to, he calls them workers without four-year degrees. We call them stars, same, if you ask me. And so there's that moment that Papia is talking about, I think is very real. And I'll also just add that Joe Biden is a community college professor, right? And community college students are stars too. So there are lots of other legislative champions that you could put in that bucket, but it's so exciting to have somebody at the top really thinking and talking about these workers positively.
Thanks, Kate and Papia. Jae-yoon, you have a question for us.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I just have a comment/question about some of the challenges that employers individually face. Like, although from macroeconomic perspective, if you look at the aggregate benefits for job candidates from STARS poll, it'll be there's a huge economic benefits as a whole. I think many employers individually feel that screening based on skills rather than on college diploma would be time consuming, particularly if they don't have resources like LinkedIn data, and also expensive. Companies often need to pay the salaries of the specialists who help them find the right candidates, an expense I think many companies cannot afford. So could you maybe comment on this kind of economic challenges that employers individually face when assessing without the category of college diploma?
Jaehyun, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for your question. You're pointing to exactly the metric that most employers are having to report into, right? That goes up to their CEO's dashboard monthly, and it's how much time did it take to find this worker, and how much did it cost, right? And those are two incredibly critical metrics for a company to continue to function. And so you're asking the exact right question about, well, if those two things are going to go up for us to find stars, how do we help de-risk that almost for an employer, right? How do we help them recognize that there's some value in this? I think that the first point I would make is that for a little while, it is going to take a little bit more time, and it is going to cost a little bit more overwhelmingly, right? So what's the business case for helping someone make that transition? I think this is where there's a couple of things that I would just point to. The first is, for a lot of these occupations, we're actually not asking you to remove the degree requirement for your engineers, for your high-end engineers, for your doctors, for your lawyers. For many of these jobs, like the customer service rep, for instance, there's an argument to be made that there's just one or two jobs that most employers should be starting with. What I'll also just say is they have de-risked hires through a lot of programmatic work that they've done, right? And to give you an example, the veteran community is one of these. What you find in an applicant tracking system is that there's actually a way to track the veteran through the entire process to effectively de-risk the hiring of the veteran. And we're saying deploy a similar process for stars, right? What that means is they're moving through to the first round because of work experience, right? And mapping that you do between jobs from their work experience to the current job that you're asking about. And then you're basically deploying the same processes to the star as you would be deploying to the bachelor's degree worker, right? And so it's actually a pretty standardized set of processes that a company could deploy once they've made that decision. And I think where we're trying to share with them insight is, we're trying to make it easier for them to say yes to their first couple of jobs within the context of their own organizations by sharing with them, listen, the majority of workers in this occupation were stars not that long ago, 10 years ago in some instances. And if you want to start to build back and make progress towards the social problem, start with the ones where you know you have stars at your company, right? You know that they're going to be capable of doing this work. Let's make it easier for you to make that first step. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I have if you don't mind, just a quick follow-up, Papia, because it strikes me that you mentioned a couple of metrics that I would put in the category of worker acquisition, but you didn't mention worker retention. And I'm curious if, working with large employers, if you're noticing that those kinds of metrics are held by different parts of the organization, and that it could be the case, for instance, that a star actually is more likely to stay in that job longer than someone who is, has a college degree, who's viewing this job as a gateway job. I'm going to do this. This is going to be my next step in moving forward. What do we know about that? And, or, what do we know about employee or corporate practices around how they're making these judgments on retention and acquisition?
Oh, I love that question. I'll share with you the answer we have so far, which is largely from partners in the field who are tracking this data over time. And so they do get not just the retention data, but they're starting to capture, pretty impressive for their sizes retention data as well. And that data is showing that stars do tend to stay in seat longer. We don't have that data at the national level. And I think that actually gets to a point Kate was making earlier too. Our federal data infrastructure does not track workers over time, right? And so one of the most fundamental things I think we can do as we think about what it looks like to activate mobility for this population is improve some of our data about them, right? I think right now, a lot of the the type of data that we have about our workers is sitting in applicant tracking systems and HR systems across the country. And that's incredibly useful data for us to be leveraging as social scientists trying to actually solve this problem, right? And so I'd love to see some initiatives come out of the policy world in the coming couple of years to actually give resources to the census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics and all the other federal statistical agencies that should be building these data sets for us to be doing better work for our workforce.
And some of the work that we've done with one of the organizations David was asking about, Leaders Up, is a great example of an organization that's like Opportunity at Work, trying to be in this space to identify stars and match them to employers in different ways. And I think it's the case if you're a small or medium employer, you're actually not going to have those functions around HR functions around retention and acquisition separate. You're going to be thinking about that collectively rather than in different departments. And so it strikes me that sometimes our practices, especially large corporations, may actually be reinforcing these disadvantages. We have time maybe for one more question from the audience. I have many, but I don't want to hog our time for sure. Any other questions? Well, I will ask it one more, and I'm just curious about, I love the fact that you're envisioning perhaps a new, I'll just call it an algorithm, if you will, that are going to take data on skills and match them to jobs in ways that we currently aren't using. And then one can look at the efficacy of that algorithm versus another. I've heard others talk about what we really need is some sort of blockchain that like kind of can be almost a new resume, if you will, that somehow, carries your skills with you as you go. And you can, once you are in a job, then that job actually adds to the ledger, if you will, and then that ledger accumulates over time and so forth. I was worried, I'll tell you why I have some worry, but I'm curious if the stakeholders you're engaging with this do see any potentially unintended consequences. We've seen now the unintended consequence of relying on the bachelor's degree. Is there anything that people are worried about with this new kind of algorithmic approach or a blockchain approach, which themselves don't really have any normative consequences built in, but one never knows. Anyway, I'll just pause there and listen to what you're hearing from stakeholders about any concerns they have with these approaches.
Oh, it's a reflection I have about anything I present related to even the data we're working with, right? Data is inherently backwards looking. It's captured what's happened in the past. Mm-hmm. And, if I think about the data sets we're looking at, these pathways reflect structural inequities in our labor market today, right? And I don't want those structural inequities reinforced in the future. And recognizing that about the data, I think, is the first step for anyone doing work in this space. There are too many conversations we have where that's not recognized in the first place, right? And that's the first thing, is we need to solve for that going forward. And there's no formula that's going to be the perfect answer for that if it's built on data sets that currently exist, because those data sets will continue to reflect the structural inequity in our labor force. What I will say is there's no one solution, right, going forward. We have to try a lot of different things. And I certainly hope we're successful on all fronts, but I absolutely expect that we're going to fail miserably in lots of ways. And I think one of the things that I've really appreciated about the leadership team at our organization is they very much expect that, and they want us to be learning quickly and to be rapidly iterating based on our learnings. And so building an organization that's equipped to do that, and that's trying to do that, and to try and bring our peers along and learn with our peers. I mean, it's an exciting time to be doing this work. It feels deeply meaningful in the context of what's happened in our world in the last few years. And I very much look forward to continuing to learn in these coming years as well. I think we're hopefully just at the beginning of what I hope is a sustained effort for many years moving forward.
That's great. Kate, any last words from your perspective?
Oh gosh, what pressure. I think my final reflection is just around the long-standing saying in HR is what you measure matters, right? And what matters you measure. And I think your question on unintended consequences is incredibly important. And And I'd be thrilled to get to a world where we start to see those unintended consequences, right? Because we've tried to measure STARS skills and we've tried to move them forward in the labor market in the way that they should be moving, right? I want to be, that's the other sort of closing thought, is this isn't charity. This isn't, a feel-good program. It's a set of workers who are highly skilled in our labor market, and we all collectively are making a set of choices that prevents them from using those skills. So I'm hopeful, I'll close this the same way I closed to the previous part. I'm hopeful that we start to measure STARS skills and that we do try a ton of things and sort of see what sticks to the wall, such that our labor market does start to move in a more equitable direction.
Thank you so much. One final word, Papia. Since you were answering my direct question, you may have one final reflection.
I'll borrow one from our CEO, and he mentioned this to me because we've been grappling with the latest findings in some of our research, and he made one point to me to kind of end the conversation, and he said, you have to remember that the future is already here. It's here in pockets, but it's inequitably distributed, right? And so part of our job is to go find where it's working and to expand those possibilities. And I feel like with a lot of really smart people actually starting to notice those things and think about what it looks like to expand them, we could actually see some really significant shifts in this generation.
That's great. That's a wonderful place to end. Papia and Kate, thank you so much for joining us. Just to our audience, as you can tell here, where we were in 2019 pre-pandemic was an unjust set of outcomes for so many people here living in the US. I'm really excited to, get to learn with you from Papia and Kate in terms of their work as social innovators to disrupt that unjust equilibrium and move us to a more just future. I agree wholeheartedly. We're going to try lots of things and we're going to learn from them. And that's the only way that we're actually going to take those concrete steps. So with that, I just want to invite everyone back who is interested. Our next seminar series, our next seminar speaker, Karin Martin, is actually a professor at the University of Washington. It's a little bit more academic oriented. So we kind of bounce back and forth between people who are the practitioners doing the social innovation work and those who are studying these programs. We were lucky today because we had a little bit of both, and I appreciate that. So again, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.